Mrs. Ashburnham, a short story by R.E. Langell. I've seen a lot of things in my day. Cannibalism, executions, the effects of yellow fever in the Congo, but nothing quite matches to the shock I received 2 years ago on New Year's Eve. I wasn't even supposed to be a participant in the whole affair, as I hadn't been due in England for several days. However, the ship had made quick time, collecting in her sails the rare tailwinds that can push a ship faster than she ought to go. As a result, I landed in England's warm embrace a day before that New Year's Eve, rather than 3 days later. I had very little interest in participating in any events, as my affairs were out of order, and I'd just come in from a long sea voyage, tailwind or no. But Mrs. Ashburnham, who caught me off my guard in the market square, simply wouldn't take no for an answer. She expounded upon the delights of spending an intimate evening with her husband, Miss Marklington, and their ward, Miss Wilkins. They were out in the country, but she had travelled into the city for a day to collect provisions. I saw my chance here to demur and put her off, as I could not be away from my flat for several days upon just returning to it. But she could not be dissuaded from having me. She intimated that Miss Marklington was intending to return to the city on New Year's Day, and could certainly be pressed into allowing me to share her cab back. So, with her assurances that I could be forced upon them all quite happily, she went away at once to finish her shopping, with the promises that she would be around at 5 p.m. sharp to take me away with her. I went home at once to try and put my flat in order as best I could, and to pick out 2 clean outfits to take with me to the Ashburnham's country estate. I admit here to a bit of happiness despite the slight annoyance I felt. The Ashburnhams were delightful acquaintances, as was Miss Marklington. I had been in Canada for a year, so I was unfamiliar with their ward. She must have had her debutante ball while I was away, but if the Ashburnhams had a ward, she was likely to be as pleasant as they were. Mr. Ashburnham was a high-ranking government official, a retired colonel from the military, and distinguished highly among his peers as level-headed and magnanimous at the same time. I always enjoyed the light-heartedness of his conversation. Unlike several of his peers, he was uninterested in political conversation, or those that would seek to divide a room, and for that I liked him all the more. Mrs. Ashburnham was a petite but strong-willed woman, with a sharp small nose and big eyes. She came from old money, her father being an earl or some such out of one of the shires. I enjoyed her banter equally to her husband's, though she carried her conversation with an edge that her opinions would not be contested under any circumstances. Together, the Ashburnhams were very strong, powerful people in England, and among the higher echelon of my acquaintances. Their home would be warm, and there would be delicious food and warm brandy, and I would have a good evening, if it were indeed to be such an intimate gathering as she suggested. At the appropriate hour, Mrs. Ashburnham presented herself and her coach to my door, and we set off together. My annoyance had worn off by this point, and I was rather looking forward to seeing some friends and ringing in a new year. In the carriage, Mrs. Ashburnham seemed excited, but also apprehensive, and try as I might, I could not get round to the reason for her slight nervousness of the coming evening. I did notice, however, that when I inquired about Miss Wilkins, her answers were somewhat more clipped and curt than otherwise. I was left to ride out the long drive to the country with her in relative silence after that, and it suited me just fine. Sometimes we feel the overwhelming urge to be constantly chattering in the presence of someone else, but with Mrs. Ashburnham the silence was encouraged as often as small talk. I appreciated her ability to be so comfortable, and as it has been my business to be around people frequently, I too have acquired this ability. Let me now skip ahead, dear reader, to the dinner on New Year's Eve, as there is very little of import in between that coach ride and the following evening. And I know that it is not the idle curiosity of the mundane that has brought you to this tale. No, by now the event has been reported by half the city, and they are painting everything in a colour that is bordering on pure untruth. You, no doubt, are looking for some clarification, some line to draw in the sand of your own, on whose sides should be believed or taken. It is only for these reasons that I write the event here so clearly and with as little prejudice as possible. I sat between Miss Marklington and Miss Wilkins at dinner. Miss Marklington was her usual self, chatty, aloof, and a bit eccentric. All the qualities that make her so special, and yet still an unwed millionaire, were on full display as she sat beside me, interrogating me about my last year in Canada. Miss Wilkins was a young 20-year-old girl whom I'd never met. She had only been taken under Mr. Ashburnham's wing as his ward last year, which is highly unusual. 20-year-old girls are rarely taken on unless they are hired as companions, but she was not a companion of Mrs. Ashburnham's. They sat across the table from one another, while Mr. Ashburnham sat at the head of the table between them both, and either he was oblivious to the tiny daggers they were glaring at each other periodically with, or he was purposefully ignoring it. Miss Wilkins would glare at Mrs. Ashburnham while engaging with me in conversation, her voice upbeat and pleasant. For my part, I answered the inquiries put to me as best as possible, without giving away too much of the project I was sent to work on. I like to create a little anonymity for my articles so that people still need to go purchase them. At any rate, dinner passed pleasantly enough. The two women kept their animosity for each other to looks alone. Regardless, I found myself floating closer to Miss Marklington for the evening, and later, as we compared notes of the night, she intimated that she was doing the same. As we retired to the parlour to pass the night away, it was clear that some past injury had been done to the proud Mrs. Ashburnham by the young Miss Wilkins. She was a strong, upright woman who'd been trained well, however, and she stayed above it even when Miss Wilkins tried to get her riled by suggesting counter-opinions to anything Mrs. Ashburnham said. The hour was drawing near, and both I and Miss Marklington were tired. I admit I feel I am getting a bit too old to be staying up past midnight to ring in the holiday. Besides all that, the custom is to kiss as the hour tolls, and only 2 people in the room would be capable of it. Personally, I am not much afflicted by witnessing public displays of affection, but the sensitivity to it of Miss Marklington had me on my toes. We drew closer to the window near the doorway to the hall as Mr. Ashburnham turned up the radio to hear the countdown. He walked over near his wife and Miss Wilkins, who, for a wonder, were standing together by the fireplace. The crackling radio sang out the numbers through the increasing static. I raised my champagne glass to Miss Markingham, who returned the gesture. We would clink glasses at the 0 count and take a sip before retiring to our rooms. It was a plan we both silently agreed to, a plan we hadn't discussed, but knew would be enacted upon the very second. I looked to Mrs. Ashburnham, who smiled radiantly at her husband. She was leaning in at the 1 count. This, reader, is when the world froze, or at least when it felt to have. My glass clinked with Miss Marklington's, but they never withdrew from one another as we both looked with Happy New Year on our lips to the scene at the fireplace. Mr. Ashburnham had leaned in for the kiss, but it was not Mrs. Ashburnham whose lips touched his. It was Miss Wilkins's. It took Mrs. Ashburnham only a moment to recover her puckered lips, but the tension was explosive. Me nor Miss Marklington could move, so rooted to the spot were we. A mistake? A joke? A miscarriage of logic and reason? Whatever could have happened to create the moment I was an unwilling witness to? But no, my reader, no mistake. On purpose. Those first words, as Mr. Ashburnham stepped over to Miss Wilkins' side, will resound in my head for a long time. I'm sorry, old girl, but we just don't match any more. He was looking at that proud, stoic, beautiful Mrs. Ashburnham who'd married him 20 years prior, while his arm was around the waist of a girl that could have been his daughter. My mind, I admit, was far more sluggish than Mrs. Ashburnham's, and I was not even the target of such animosity. The radio crackled celebrations and festivities as the fire in the grate popped. I tell you now, I felt no warmth from that fire, and the meal I'd eaten so gracefully felt heavy in my guts. All I wished to do was to edge out of the room and escape witnessing this event at all. To her credit, all Miss Ashburnham did was snort at his remark. She left her arms limp and placed her champagne glass down carefully. "And where do you propose you and the child will go, assuming I grant you the divorce you've so clearly intentioned on getting?" Her eyes were like fire, but there was barely a tremor in her voice. It is scary how well trained the noble elite among us are. The child now spoke, her voice dripping with her assumed rights. "We shall take the London house, since you've never liked it anyway." I felt a tug on my sleeve, and glasses still raced together. Miss Marklington was sliding me imperceptibly toward the door with her. Treasure of a woman that she was, we did not make it out before the end. "Silly child, did you think that what was mine was his? Leave by the morning, both of you, and never return before me." With that, she left the room, blowing past me and Miss Marklington like an unaffected wind. I thought that perhaps the signs of this event were in the wind for a year, and thus Mrs. Ashburnham had girded herself against it. Truly, she was correct. Everything they owned was hers. Mr. Ashburnham was elevated by his service record and personality, whereas Mrs. Ashburnham had the money. Miss Wilkins turned to Mr. Ashburnham and clutched his vest in the dramatic way that only young women can. She entreated him that he must own some of it or fight her in the court for it. It was rightfully theirs, after all. Mr. Ashburnham had apparently not informed the girl of the ironclad prenuptial agreement he'd signed 20 years earlier. When she found out, she too stormed away to vent. Her image of being a lady rather shattered, and the clock only read 3 minutes past. Miss Marklington took this as her opportunity and escaped, but I found myself rooted to the room with Mr. Ashburnham. He sat on the sofa, sighed, and poured a drink. I stared at him with oblivious candor. How could it have happened? They were a perfect couple, so happy and in love always. He looked at me with sad eyes, and that was when the spell broke. I admit, as I left the room, I was not a perfect guest. I said a few choice words at him, labeling him relatively rudely for his terrible judgment. The next day, Miss Marklington and I compared notes on our way back to London. We simply could not believe that such a loving and transparent relationship had come to ruin. And it had been loving and transparent, dear reader. They were constantly traveling together. They went to all events together and constantly displayed their affection in that upright way of the English nobility. There were never squabbles or disagreements. They led full, confident, and satisfied lives. Later, it would be this consistency that Mr. Ashburnham quoted as his reasons for leaving her. He would say it was boring, and he would slowly unwind his public trust. The last I heard, he was living in a flat on the northeast side of London alone. Miss Wilkins did not stay on board with him very long after she realized he was an old man with a small income. The papers currently are painting him as a sad poor man down on his luck, and Miss Nottingham, as Mrs. Ashburnham has changed her name back to her maiden name, as an ugly, money-hungry witch. Let me appease these aspersions immediately, as the media's memory is quite short. Miss Nottingham is a brilliant woman who did not give an inch of her pride or possessions to the man who trampled all over her heart. She did not keep back anything that was rightfully his, either. She sold the London house shortly after the divorce and remained in her country home alone for a long time. She now sees Miss Marklington often, and they have grown very close. She has only recently been seen in public, and at the opera house again. However, the fire in her eye, that bold way in which she once spoke, is gone. And though she is well provided for, I suspect her situation is every bit as sad as Mr. Ashburnham's. Perhaps more so, for there is one glaring difference between the two, one that I will carry with me as a lesson in life. They are both sad and devastated. However, only one has been betrayed. And betrayal is a sadness unlike any other as far as I can tell. Miss Nottingham has only now begun to reclaim her social status with Miss Marklington's help, But I hope, reader, that you are under no illusions that this means she is over the horrible thing that has been done to her. Mr. Ashburnham, though living in a small flat, on a reduced income and lifestyle, is no different. Only his living situation has changed, but after the initial shock of the scandal, he has reclaimed, for the most part, his social life. Those who were his friends before remain so now, with very little variance. He still goes to parties, and though he admits he has lost something precious, he is unaffected as far as society is concerned. Even now he is painted as a victim because Miss Nottingham has begun her re-entrance into society. I saw Mr. Ashburnham at the New Year's Eve party I attended, just this past year, and he seemed in high, happy spirits, as is his usual wont, his round, full belly rumbling as he laughed and smoked and discussed hunting. To this day, Miss Nottingham does not participate in New Year's Eve. The end.